I'm extraordinarily privileged to have on stage and in the room and in Dunedin and coming to our conference, David and Kate, who I've had the pleasure of both interacting with informally and in more formal settings over the course of the past year. As a Sri Lankan, I must say, and I want to say this publicly, that I have been astonished by the caliber and the camaraderie of policymakers and academics in this country, which is somewhat trite, I suppose, to mention for all of you, but it's not the culture that we have in many other parts of the world, to be so embracing of, at the end of the day, an alien from another country, and to have the kinds of discussions we've had and to enjoy the intellectual repartee over the past year. So thank you for coming in person, making the time. It is not something that any of us take for granted, given your workloads respectively. So the session really is on regulation, stuff that we touched on or that we engaged with initially in broad brushstrokes with Vijay from Twitter. And I'm not going to spend too much time going through an introduction. I think that the importance of this issue is both well recognized here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but is a really hot button issue globally. And that is something that we want to the extent possible, unpack. Any one of you can go first. I have no preference, so fight it amongst yourselves. Okay, you go first. Okay. Yeah, it is on. Yeah, fantastic.
Nā mihi nui ki a koutou. Ko Minator te maunga, ko Ngāti Wera te iwi, ko Kate Hannah ahau. It's lovely to be back here in this beautiful part of the country where I did get to study. I'm very affectionate about. We're not doing introductions, so you can figure out why you're supposed to listen to my rants by Googling me.
You're free to introduce yourself. I just don't want to do it.
I'm a historian who works in science and technology studies, and for the last year I've been working mainly on disinformation. I've got a background in Holocaust revisionism. I've spent a lot of my life in the darkest places of the internet and in the darkest places of the libraries, so that you don't have to, except you probably all do too. I always want to draw from what other people have been saying in spaces like this, and I really want to reflect on the previous speakers, on Lana and Te Rikiriina, thinking about when we're thinking about this idea of violence and hate speech online that David and I are going to talk about with Sanjana, around kind of that Habermasian idea of the public and private sphere, this kind of dichotomy that was presented to us. And that was a really highly gendered dichotomy and always has been. Women were the angel in the house and the public sphere was for men. Obviously, non-binary people didn't even come into the question at the time when these kind of constructs were being settled upon. And thinking about how the space of the internet, but the space of other parts of contemporary culture are at times both public and private. And I'm reflecting quite personally here on how my workplace at a university is both it's a public institution. Anyone can wander into a university. You know, right now there are all sorts of people walking through using this as a shortcut. Free to go into the library and try and read books. They can't borrow them because they'd have to pay an inordinate amount of money, which is another whole problem with universities that we won't go into here. But there are also private spaces. That's where I work. It's where my office is. It's where I have a door that I shut against the world to do my work. And when you are the kind of experiences we're talking about now as a woman online or in a public-private space like a university, or perhaps as a journalist, or even reflecting back on what Em was talking about with the circumstance with the Prime Minister and the expectations that the Prime Minister will turn up to be harangued and harassed and harried by Mike Hosking on a weekly basis. You know, these are all expectations of the public sphere, that we have this role that we must play publicly and that we can't complain about how we get treated in these spaces. But these spaces are at times both private and public. And I kind of wanted to draw from that to think about some of the work I've previously done around the dangers for people who are not the normative culture, which in this case means white, male, heterosexual, middle class, etc., to being visible, and that visibility can create a thing that I've called hypervisibility, which is an incredibly dangerous place to be, and which really reflects a lot of the conversations that have been previously had today. And I really wanted to point out that comment that Lana made around the need for those peoples to express their trauma to be listened to, that we have to reiterate over and over again that kind of trauma porn of what it feels like to be both public and private in these spaces. But I do also think that there is a point we can touch on again that was drawn on in the last session on those ideas of the undercommons. The notion of the whisper network came smashing out into public consciousness a couple of years ago with the hashtag #MeToo movement, and the idea that there were these whisper networks around Hollywood where people would tell people who were safe and not safe to work with. And every woman and a non-binary person and person of colour around the world laughed and laughed as white men discovered that we'd been talking about them behind their backs for centuries, using the mechanisms that we had available to ourselves. And I think that the power of these online platforms in being places that we can have those conversations can't be undercut, even though they are at the same time the places that we very much do get harassed, harried, and harangued. I will pass to David now, and we can then converse.
Kia ora, thanks, Kate. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Ruahine toko manga, ko Tuki Tuki toko awa, ko Shanks toko hapu, ko David toko ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. As some of you may have recognised from that brief mihi, I'm from Hawke's Bay originally. I mentioned the Ruahine Ranges and Tuki Tuki River. I'm from Waipukurau originally, but I've also got connections to this place. I went to university in Otago, and I well remember, I mean, the sun is shining, there's a light breeze, just as I remember every day being when I was a student here. But it's great to be here. It's a privilege to be here talking about these really critical and important issues at this point in time. For those of you that don't know me, I am David Shanks. I am your chief censor. And as you might expect from that title, I've had a lot to think about in the spaces that we're addressing here. In fact, I've just realized that I've spent a lot of time worrying about the dark web, whereas in fact I should have been concerned about dark Zoom, which I've just heard about from this very forum. So, but this is the nature of the challenge. Technology keeps moving, spaces keep opening up. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about extremism. We're talking about violence. We're talking about hatred. We're talking about racism. We're talking about misogyny. We're talking about toxic disinformation. Wow, that's a lot, isn't it? And it's entirely, these are long-standing complex issues. It's entirely unreasonable to blame all of that on technology and social media, isn't it? Is it? Well, we're at a conference here talking about technology and social media, part sponsored by Twitter. So let's go there for a minute. Because a little while ago, I read an interesting article, and the article was focusing on the top 9 kind of tech titans in Silicon Valley. You're talking about Zuckerberg, talking about Bezos, Musk. And the article was interesting because it said, look, in the past year, the net worth of the top 9 individuals in that sector went up by $360 billion in the past year. So it would have gone up significantly irrespective, but the pandemic, of course, has accelerated online activity and online trading, and so their wealth has increased by $360 billion for those individuals. And of course, the pass-ons in terms of profitability for the companies that they have shareholdings in is vastly greater than that. So, I mean, that gets me thinking, right? Because if you look through human history about when you have that kind of wealth accumulating that quickly to that smaller number of individuals, someone else is paying in some way. There's some cost being taken in some way. Think about it. Think about through history. Historically, there's not that many reference points, but there are incidences of civilizations accumulating great wealth through slavery, right? More recently, there's been a case of enormous wealth accruing through industrial exploitation, which is the oil industry. If you look at the 20s and 30s and the rise of massive oil monopolies, you can see that kind of wealth being accumulated that rapidly. And what's the cost of that, you may ask? Well, we're paying for it now with 1 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere that nobody knows what to do with. And I just can't help but wondering what is the unseen consequences or implications of this kind of wealth accumulation and concentration of this industry? We have people talking about the attention economy, surveillance capitalism. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And I think all of these elements are quite important as we think about the architecture of the issues that we're dealing with here. Because, I mean, I hear repeatedly when you talk about making a move, making a change in this space, actually, first of all, when I started talking about changes in this space, well, the problems aren't, there's not really a problem here, or if it is a problem, it's not a technological or social media problem, it's a society problem. I think we've heard enough already today to put that to rest. There are significant problems. In fact, you heard Vidya remarkably, saying, I think, things are getting worse. The indicators we're seeing are that not only there is a problem, the problem is worsening, right? That this is quite a change in narrative from someone working in the industry, because quite recently I would hear from the industry, actually, there isn't a problem, or if it is, it's just a society problem, nothing to do with us. So there is a problem and it seems to be getting worse. So the next question, the next proposition is, well, yeah, there is a problem, but you can't do anything about it. It's too complex. It's too multifaceted. It's, it's this, it's that. Well, I think you can do something about it. I think there are interventions giving rise that we can think about. And Vidya, in fact, mentioned, actually, there's all kinds of social, educational, civil society interventions that we could and should be looking at in this space. But I want to talk about regulation for a bit, because when you start talking about regulation, the third and final defensive proposition is you'll break the internet. If you're going to regulate this space, you break the internet. Well, if you gave me 20 ICBMs with independently targeted nuclear warheads and told me to try and break the internet, I could not. The internet is one tough sucker. It's a distributed military grade network that routes around damage. So, you can't break the internet, but regulation has been teased at in some of the discussions so far, might go some way towards breaking a digital industrial business model. And I think we shouldn't be afraid or scared of thinking about what that might mean and thinking about what it takes to build a civically healthier, more humane tech internet and set of platforms, because I think that's the fundamental pivot point where we're at right now. And I'm seeing, rays of possibility all around the world right now in this space. Look at the EU legislative proposals around a Digital Services Act. Look at the white paper on digital harms in the UK. Look at Canada's going to be coming out with some innovative approaches shortly. Look at Ireland, where they look at the existing traditional ways that you can moderate harm, through a classification model, which I guess the Chief Censor represents, through a standards model, which our Broadcasting Standards Authority and Media Council operate in, through a mediation model, which you'd see NetSafe implementing very successfully in certain areas through the harmful digital communications model, and through other mechanisms as well, making the black box that is social media and digital platforms more transparent, so that actually we can look down the road and see where harms may be generated, building, and may be of concern, because currently we don't have that info, and we don't have the research as people have spoken about. But there is plenty of scope, plenty of possibility for brave, bold, constructive, collaborative thinking, and possibly most importantly of all, here now in this country, in this space, listening to those who are most affected by these harms, listening to the people who are most at risk, but also have the most to say about how we can change the system and build something that represents our Māori culture, Pacifica peoples, women, people of colour. We need to actually get all of those elements into the mix at this point in time. So I welcome the opportunity that we have right here to talk about exactly those things.
Thanks, David. 2 quick questions, and then we'll open it up. Listen, let's get down to brass tacks, Kate. We have talked about the genesis of some of these social media companies and the expletives that executives today who want to brand themselves very differently as started off the companies with when they were in their dorm rooms. Yeah. I don't need to mention the names. I think the stories are fairly well known. So there's an encoded misogyny and the toxic masculinity, however which way you want to cut it. These platforms are rooted in violence, however you want to define it. So the question is, to which and to what degree can you see that changing, despite what we heard in the morning? Which is the question to you, and David, to you, and in a sense connected to that is two questions. We are 2 years after Christchurch, and in a sense the questions are getting harder and more complex, but also importantly increasing at pace. And what can a regulator do in what in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, a classic VUCA model? With the tools that you've inherited that kind of aren't fit for purpose anymore, and to kind of reflect on that from Aotearoa, but to also say that what happens here matters to the rest of the world as well. So if you could respond, and then we could open it up. Thank you.
I love a Sanjana question. I think that's really, really true. There is an innate, ingrained, encoded misogyny and racism in specific of the platforms, and there is a platform that can remain nameless that if it broke, nobody here would really be very upset, I don't think. The one that was built in a dorm room to assess women based on their attractiveness. But I think there's a really interesting space in here where there is an innate inability of the platforms themselves, also of the regulators, and I say this very kindly to my friend and colleague David, and also to the institutions, of which I sort of represent one of the types of colonial racist institutions, a university. Our structures are not able to respond appropriately because we are populated by largely white people who are not really, unless perhaps they're women, the people who are most likely to be harmed via these platforms. And so there is a real need for, as David just pointed out, that harms-based listening and building from the communities that are most at risk and most at danger. And thinking back to yesterday's 2-year anniversary of the deaths of 51 people in Otautahi, through to this morning, where I've spent most of the morning back and forth emailing around a young person who has been infiltrating lecture theatres on my campus and shouting things related to, yesterday's anniversary, both yesterday and today. Clearly somebody who is probably mentally unwell at the moment and is being looked after appropriately, but also noting to my colleagues in security, etc., that we do also need to write down what it was that this young person was saying so that we can understand the contexts. And thinking back towards my colleagues who were trying to teach at that time in this weird public-private space that is a university, trying to teach through that and support students through that, that we are not listening in the right places. We're not listening to the right people. I can say it because I'm not a public servant, but government's really, really white and really, really middle class, terrifyingly so. I know I sound really naive, but yeah, the last year I'm like, wow, there really are a lot of white people who are policy analysts. And that ability to recognise potential harm has been really explicitly shown in that even our sponsor, Twitter, I mean, in the last 24 hours, I reported an account which had been established earlier a couple of weeks ago. The image on the account was the white supremacist hand signal. So this is the kind of inability to assess that I'm talking about. There is no sitting there knowledge of being able to say, actually, that hand signal is something we should be looking at as a visual image. Is that an appropriate visual image to be having as your avatar on Twitter? And reflecting also on the fact that Mark Dalder, the journalist, wrote about after the Christchurch Royal Commission report came out, how the material that the shooter had articulated online prior to stopping his public posting so that he could go sort of into the dark web was the kind of material that Mark himself comes across every day. And I have to say that having read the report in its entirety, that is the kind of material that I come across every single day in my work. And I don't know what I should and shouldn't report. And so at the moment, unfortunately for all of you in government, I'm reporting nearly everything that I come across in the hope that we might stop this. But there is a gap, and that's kind of the gap that I think David wants to talk about, how we might have ways of filling it.
Yeah, well, thanks, I think. So the question to me is, as I recall it now, was, look, two years on, I mean, we've had some horrific events, some just staggering wake-up calls about what harm can look like and what it can do in this space. So what can a regulator do, I think, is essentially. Look, at one level, as Chief Censor, I'm good. I can actually call in under the powers granted on me by the Films, Videos and Publications Act. I can call in any publication, which includes any digital publication, any post on Facebook or social media, if I think it is harmful or injurious to the public good, and classify it, potentially restrict it or classify it as objectionable, which means it's unlawful for any of you to possess or view it at penalty of extreme lengths of imprisonment. Job done. So I could just go out and start classifying harmful stuff on the internet and making it objectionable and making it all unlawful for any of you to access and see it, and kind of, I guess, raise that with search engines and social media platforms. Yeah, does that work? No, it doesn't work, of course. That'd be ridiculous. But look, I mean, this is the pre-internet kind of legislation that I'm operating under. But it is literally what we've got right now. But it doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to think, what can a regulator do? I think I, as a regulator, can raise with the very white middle class and some often somewhat closeted kind of people who architect the system to go, look, actually we can be better than this, and this is an opportunity to think broadly and deeply and listen to other voices about what good looks like in this space. And I go back to what I was saying, which is, I think there's some very obvious moves that we can do here to make the current regulatory system and framework more coherent and work better and be fitter for purpose for a digital environment. Now, is that easy? No. Is it going to be perfect? Absolutely not. Are we going to be able to make a move and learn from it and move forward? Yes, absolutely. I would say finally, I think regulatory process is not really fit for purpose for footing it with digital speed and change. You know, I've seen over and over again policymakers take a bead on an aspect of this problem and spend maybe 3 years working up the perfect solution, and then kind of doing a sense check just before they move and go, oh, everything's changed. Actually, in fact, what we thought we were shooting at, it doesn't even exist anymore, or it's changed so fundamentally that we have to go back to the starting point. And that, you know, that literally has been the picture of the last 30 years of the existence of the internet. We must move beyond that.
I'm going to open it up to the floor. Just Kate, it bears recognition and reflection that you said it as an offhandish comment, but the sheer emotional toll it takes on dealing with this toxicity, I don't know for you, but certainly for me as a doctoral candidate and researcher, it's significant. You know, looking at my research, not from Aotearoa, but from Sri Lanka, and you don't talk about it. It's horrible, and you have to deal with it every single day. For me, of course, it's somewhat of a choice, but it's certainly not a choice to see that. And then, of course, the conundrum is what do you do with it? So I just wanted to, if you want to talk about it later on, we want to open it up.
Oh, I just would quickly say that it is huge, but that I have a process and it's been really interesting. I don't know if you have a process.
I do. I don't want to share.
Yeah, I know. I'm happy to talk about my process with other people, but because I largely work and collaborate with scientists, you know, to talk through kind of a social science process of entering the archive and ritually washing my hands before I go into a space, including an online space, and ritually washing my hands afterwards. Not a COVID response, but a response to separating myself from the material and acknowledging that you can't spend all of your time in it. And also talking about this because particularly with students, it's really important to set them up with good practices for engaging with this content. There is a fantastic paper by a woman called Katie Barclay called Love in the Archives, which is about affect and archival work, where she says this wonderful line in it's a history paper. There are some historians who tell me they have never wept in the archives. And then you can just, there's this like eye roll emoji gap, like it's not actually an emoji, but of course, the people who've never cried in the archives are people who are not affected by the kind of work they're doing. And do we want the people who are unaffected by the work they're doing in charge of designing our platforms, the ways we communicate with each other? So weeping is good.
That's a fundamental conundrum. We can open it up for questions.